She was 18 years old, standing in the middle of nowhere with a torn bag, $20, and a letter that turned out to be a lie. The town laughed, the men leered, and when she fell to her knees in the summer dust of Wyoming, she didn't cry. She pressed her fists into the dirt and got back up. That was the moment Caleb Morgan saw her. And that was the moment everything changed for both of them. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter had promised her a job. That was the whole of it. One letter written in careful ink on good paper, signed by a man named Gerald Fitch, who called himself the business manager of the Hargrove Ranch operation out of Ridgeline, Wyoming territory. The letter had said, bookkeeper needed room and board, provided fair wage, start date, July the 5th, 1884. It had said inquire at the stage depot in Ridgeline and ask for directions to the Hargrove property. It had said all of that, and Evelyn Carter had read it 14 times on the 3-day journey west, because it was the only solid thing she had left to hold on to. She was 18 years old. She had $22 folded inside her left boot, a carpet bag with 2 dresses, and her mother's Bible, and a ledger book she'd carried since she was 15, because numbers made sense to her when almost nothing else did. She had come from Salina, Kansas, where the only thing that had kept her employed was the fact that old Mr. Draper at the dry goods store had been too nearsighted to realize she was a girl until she'd already proven herself indispensable. When Mr. Draper died in March and his son took over the store, the son had looked at Evelyn across the counter and said without a trace of embarrassment that he didn't employ women and she could collect her final wages on Friday. She had found the advertisement for the Hargrove position in a Kansas City paper 2 weeks later. She had written immediately. She had not mentioned that she was a woman or 18, or that she had no references aside from a dead man. She had simply listed her qualifications, her experience with double-entry bookkeeping, her familiarity with inventory accounts and supply ledgers and payroll reconciliation. Gerald Fitch had written back inside of 10 days. The letter had felt like a door opening. Now she stood in Ridgeline, Wyoming in the full heat of a July afternoon, and the door had turned out to lead off a cliff. The man at the stage depot, a short, sun-weathered fellow with a tobacco stain on his beard, had squinted at her letter and then looked at her, the way men always looked at her when she was trying to conduct business, like he was trying to figure out whether she was confused or stupid. "Gerald Fitch," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He hired me as bookkeeper for the Hargrove Ranch. I was told to ask for directions here." The man scratched his jaw. "Miss Gerald Fitch left Ridgeline 6 weeks ago, went back east. Far as I know, the Hargrove operation folded when old Hargrove died in May. There ain't no job, there ain't no ranch, not anymore." The street behind him went on being loud and dusty and indifferent. Evelyn stood very still. She had learned in 18 years that the moment when everything collapsed was not the moment to fall apart. That moment could come later privately when no one was watching. Right now, what mattered was not showing this tobacco-stained man that her stomach had just dropped through the earth. "I see," she said. "Is there a hotel in town?" "Boarding house on Sycamore. Mrs. Pell runs it. She's reasonable." "Thank you." She picked up her bag and walked. She made it half a block before her left boot caught a rut in the road, and she went down hard, both knees hitting the packed dirt, her carpet bag splitting at the seam and spilling her spare dress and her mother's Bible into the dust in front of about 15 people who were standing along the main street with nothing better to do than watch a girl fall apart in public. Nobody moved to help her. One man laughed a short, dismissive sound like she was a minor amusement. A woman across the street whispered something to the woman beside her. Evelyn felt their attention like heat on the back of her neck. She pressed her hands flat against the dirt. She looked at her mother's Bible lying open in the road pages fluttering in the summer wind. She thought, "I will not cry here. I will not cry here in front of any of these people." She pushed herself up. She was still on one knee, gathering her Bible and her dress back into the broken bag, trying to figure out how to hold it shut, when a shadow fell over her from the left. A large hand came down and picked up the Bible before she could reach it. She looked up, ready to snatch it back, and stopped. The man crouching beside her was not what she expected. He was tall, she could tell even crouching with dark hair and several days of shadow along his jaw. His eyes were the color of creek water in shade gray-green and direct in a way that had nothing threatening in it. He was wearing a canvas workshirt collar open with a leather vest over it, and the kind of boots that had been worn hard for years. His hat was pushed back on his head. He looked like a man who had spent every day of his adult life outdoors doing difficult physical work, and he looked utterly unbothered by the fact that everyone on the street was watching. He held the Bible out to her without a word. She took it. "Thank you," she said, because her mother had raised her to say thank you even when the world was ending. He looked at her bag. "That seam's gone. You hold the top and I'll carry it." "I can manage." "I didn't say you couldn't." He wasn't unkind about it. He was simply stating a fact. He looked at her again with those creek water eyes. "You the girl who came in on the stage from Kansas?" She stiffened slightly. "News travels fast. Small town, Hargrove job." "There is no Hargrove job, as I've just discovered." He looked at her for a moment, not the way the man at the depot had looked at her, not assessing or dismissive, but like he was making a decision. Then he stood and put out his hand, the open palm of it a steadying gesture more than anything else. She took it and stood. "Caleb Morgan," he said. "I've got a ranch about 7 miles up the mountain. I do need a bookkeeper as it happens. Have needed one for about 8 months, and haven't found one worth a damn." He paused. That was blunt. "Forgive the language." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I've heard worse. What are the terms?" He almost smiled. Not quite, his face was too guarded for a full smile, but something shifted around the corners of his eyes. "Room and board, fair wage. You'd have your own room. The work is ranch account, supply orders, payroll for 4 hands. It's real work, not light work. The mountain's rough country in summer and rougher in winter." "I'm not afraid of rough country," Evelyn said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough to say. "I reckon not," he said. "Or you wouldn't have come this far alone." She looked at him for a moment longer. This was the calculation she had made before with Mr. Draper, and it had served her for 3 years. "Look at the man. Decide if he is honest. Decide if you can work with him." The dishonest ones had a particular quality around the eyes, a restlessness, a calculation of their own running just behind the surface. This man's eyes were still. Whatever he was deciding about her, he was deciding it plainly and without agenda. "All right," she said. "When do we leave?" "Again." His name was the only easy thing about him. Caleb Morgan said almost nothing on the 7-mile ride up the mountain. He drove the wagon with the ease of someone who had made this particular trip enough times that it required no conscious thought, and he seemed to have no need to fill the silence with conversation. Evelyn, who had grown up in a household where silence meant someone was angry, had to actively resist the urge to talk simply to fill the space. She watched the land instead. She had never seen country like this. Kansas was flat and enormous and beautiful in a way that pressed down on you. Wyoming in the mountains was something else entirely. Rock faces and pine stands and summer grass, so green it looked painted the whole of it, rising and folding around them as the road climbed. The heat of the valley fell away as they gained elevation. By the time the ranch came into view, the air had a clarity to it that felt almost like cold water. The ranch itself was smaller than she had pictured. A main house built of dark timber, solid and square, with a covered porch along the front. A barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar built into the hillside. 4 horses in the near pasture. Everything was worn, but everything was cared for, the kind of place that showed not wealth, but consistent long attention. A man came out of the barn as they pulled in, young, maybe 20, Mexican, with a careful way of moving. "Raphael," Caleb said, climbing down from the wagon. "This is Miss Carter. She'll be taking the bookkeeper position. Show her to the east room." Raphael looked at Evelyn with frank and uncomplicated curiosity. "Yes, sir. Welcome, Miss Carter. You want water? It's been hot since noon." "Water would be wonderful," Evelyn said, and meant it with her whole body. She was given the east room, which was small and clean, and had a window that looked toward the mountain rather than down toward the valley. There was a bed with a quilt on it, a washstand, a small desk and chair. It was the most private space she had occupied since her mother died 4 years ago, and she'd moved into the back room at the boarding house where 3 other women slept on the same floor. She set her broken bag on the bed. She put her mother's Bible on the desk. She sat down on the edge of the mattress and allowed herself for exactly 1 minute to feel the full weight of the last 8 hours. Then she stood up, washed her face and hands, and went to find out what the accounts looked like. The accounts were a disaster. Not crooked, just neglected. 8 months of receipts shoved in a box, payroll figures scratched on loose paper, a supply ledger that hadn't been properly updated since the previous October. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with everything spread out in front of her and felt for the first time that day something that was almost calm. This was a problem she could solve. Caleb came in from outside, sometime after dark, washed up at the pump on the porch, and came into the kitchen to find her with 2 columns of figures and a fresh pot of coffee she had helped herself to because Raphael had shown her where everything was. He looked at the papers, then at her. "You started. You said it was real work. I thought I'd see what that meant." He sat down across from her and poured himself coffee without asking, which she didn't mind. "What do you see? You're owed money you haven't collected. 3 suppliers have overcharged you on deliveries, and you either didn't notice or didn't push back. Your payroll is accurate, but your records are a mess, which means if anyone ever audits you, you'll spend a week just finding the documents." She looked at him steadily. "None of it is unfixable, but you needed someone to look at it 6 months ago." "I know," he said. "Why didn't you hire someone sooner?" Something shifted in his expression, a closing like a door swinging almost shut. "The last man I hired took 6 weeks of wages and left with half my petty cash fund." He said it evenly without self-pity. "After that, I was cautious." "That's understandable." "You're not what I expected," he said. She looked up from the figures. "What did you expect? Someone older?" He seemed to consider something. "Someone less steady." "I'm not steady," Evelyn said, and surprised herself by saying it. "I'm just good at not showing when I'm not." He looked at her across the table for a moment, that same direct, still attention he'd given her in the street when he'd made his decision, and then he nodded like she had confirmed something he'd already suspected. "You'll want to know," he said, "that I'm not an easy man to work for, not because I'm unkind, because I keep to myself and I work long days, and I don't make conversation for the sake of it." He paused. "I reckon you've already noticed." "I've noticed," she said. "Does that suit you?" She thought of the boarding house in Salina, the women on her floor who talked every evening until she wanted to press her face into her pillow and scream just for 5 minutes of quiet. She thought of Mr. Draper's son, who had talked constantly and pleasantly about nothing and had fired her without a second thought. "Yes," she said. "That suits me fine." She had been at the ranch 11 days when the trouble started showing itself. She might not have seen it at all if she hadn't been good at numbers. Numbers she had found told you the truth even when people didn't. And the numbers in Caleb Morgan's accounts were starting to tell her something that made the back of her neck prickle. It was a bill of lien she found first, tucked behind 3 months of feed receipts, like someone had hoped it would be lost. Dated February of that year, recorded against Parcel 12 of the Ridgeline Mountain Survey, which was 40 acres on the east slope of Caleb's property. The lien was held by something called the Holloway Land and Development Corporation. The amount was $450. She looked at the document for a long time. Then she went and found Raphael in the barn. "Does Mr. Morgan have a loan against the east parcel?" she asked. Raphael's expression did something careful and unhappy. "He didn't tell you about that. He didn't mention it." Raphael went back to the bridle he was cleaning, which meant he was deciding how much to say. Mr. Victor Holloway came around in February. He said Mr. Morgan owed him money from a debt his father made years back. He had papers. Mr. Morgan, Raphael stopped. "He should tell you himself." Raphael. "I was gone 3 days after Holloway came," Raphael said quietly. "Came back and didn't say nothing about it, but he stopped riding the east slope after that, and Holloway's men have been up on that ridgeline twice this summer." Evelyn looked out the barn door at the mountain. "What does Holloway want?" "The whole east slope, ma'am. There's a creek up there. Only reliable water source for 40 miles in a dry summer. Raphael looked at her. You understand what that means for a ranch. She understood exactly what that meant. She thought about not saying anything. It would have been easier. She had been here 11 days. This was not her fight. Whatever Caleb Morgan had going on with Victor Holloway and a lien on his east pasture was not her problem, and if she got involved, she might find herself without a position again before she'd properly settled into this one. She thought all of that very clearly and deliberately on the walk from the barn to the main house. Then she spread the line document on the kitchen table next to the open ledger and waited for Caleb to come in for the midday meal. He looked at it as soon as he came through the door. His face didn't change, not a flinch, not a flicker, but he stopped moving, which was its own kind of reaction from a man who was always in motion. "Where did you find that?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "Behind the August feed receipts." She kept her voice level. "I almost missed it." He came to the table and stood there looking at the document. His hands were at his sides. I was going to deal with it." "How?" Silence. "Caleb." It was the first time she had used his name directly. He looked up at her. "How are you going to deal with it?" "I've been putting together what I could," he said, trying to get ahead of it. He pulled out the chair and sat down heavily, and she noticed for the first time that he looked tired. Not the physical tired of long days, but the kind of tired that came from carrying something for too long. "My father had a debt with Harlan Holloway, Victor's father, years back. A livestock purchase that went bad. He signed something. I don't know exactly what he signed. I was 17 when he died, and by the time I found the paperwork, it was too complicated to parse. Victor Holloway is using his father's debt to claim the east parcel," Evelyn said. "That's what his lawyers say." "Is the debt legitimate?" He looked at her. "I don't know." "Then we need to find out." She sat down across from him. "Your father's papers, do you have them?" "Some. In the storage chest in the back room. I haven't gone through all of it." "I'd like to look at them." Howe was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who made decisions slowly and carried them long, and she had learned enough in 11 days to know that pushing him only made him go quieter. So she waited. "Why?" he said finally. "Because if Holloway's claim isn't legitimate, it'll be in the paperwork. Fraudulent liens have signatures and dates that don't match. They have witnesses who can't be found and references to debts that were never formally recorded." She met his eyes. "I'm a bookkeeper, Caleb. This is what I do." He looked at her for a long time. "The chest is in the back room," he said. "Third shelf. It's not locked." She spent 3 evenings in the back room going through his father's papers. She did not ask Caleb to help, and he didn't offer. He moved around the house in the evenings while she worked. She could hear him on the porch, or moving through the kitchen, or outside with the horses in the long summer dusk. Occasionally, he brought her coffee without saying anything and set it beside her and left again. She found the original debt record on the 3rd evening. It was a promissory note dated 1871, signed by William Morgan Caleb's father, and witnessed by 2 men, a man named Patterson and a man named Garvey. The amount was $230 for a livestock purchase. The terms were clear: repayment in 3 annual installments, beginning in 1872. The note was stamped, "Paid in full," in faded but legible red ink with a date September 14, 1874. She turned it over. On the back in handwriting, she didn't recognize "final payment received" and "acknowledged." "Debt cleared. H. Holloway." She sat for a moment with the paper in both hands. Then she stood up and went to find Caleb. He was on the porch in the last of the light, sitting in the chair he always sat in, looking at the mountain. He turned when he heard the door. She held out the note. He looked at it. He read it slowly. The light was almost gone, and she watched him tip the paper slightly to catch what remained of it. When he looked up at her, something had shifted in his face. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of it. The specific expression of a man who has been braced against a wall and has just felt it give. "My father paid it," he said. "He paid it, and they're pretending he didn't." "Yes." "How much did they change?" "Nothing. They didn't change the original note. They're hoping you never found this or that. If you did, you wouldn't know what it meant." She met his eyes. Victor Holloway's lien against your East parcel is based on a debt that was cleared 13 years ago. It's fraud, Caleb. He was quiet for a moment. The mountain was darkening, the last gold going out of the peaks. You understand what that means, he said. If I go against Holloway with this, if I try to fight him, he's not going to just accept it. He's got money and lawyers and half the county officials in his pocket. I know, she said. This isn't just a legal dispute. He's been moving on other ranches too, buying up water rights, forcing people out. He looked at her. It would be easier to let it go. Sell the East parcel, move on. Evelyn thought about the woman who had whispered to her neighbor when she fell in the road. She thought about Mr. Draper's son and his pleasant voice and his complete indifference to what she'd built. She thought about the letter from Gerald Fitch that had promised her a door and opened onto nothing. She thought about what it meant to let things go, where letting things go led. No, she said. It wouldn't. He looked at her sharply. It would be easier right now, she said, for about 30 days. And then Holloway would own the creek and half your water supply, and you'd be looking at losing the whole ranch within 2 years instead of 40 acres now. She held his gaze. You didn't build this place to give it up. I've been here 11 days and I can see that. Anyone who looks at this ranch can see that. The silence between them held. The first star was appearing over the mountain. You're not what I expected, he said, the second time he'd said it. You said that already. I know. He looked at the promissory note in his hands. I mean it differently now. She didn't ask him what he meant. There were things that didn't need words pushed at them. She had learned that in this house in 11 days, without quite noticing she was learning it. I can make copies of this document tonight, she said. We should have more than one, and in the morning you should tell me everything you know about Holloway's other land claims, because if he's done this to you, he's done it to someone else, and someone else might have papers too. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had gone from closed to careful, not open, not yet, but no longer entirely shut. All right, he said. She went inside to copy the document. He stayed on the porch a while longer. When she came back for the lamp, she could see him still sitting there in the dark, the mountain behind him and the summer stars coming out one by one above the ridge. And he was looking at the note in his hands like a man who had just been told that something he'd given up on might still be possible. She didn't say anything. She took the lamp and went back to work. That night, after she had made 3 copies of the promissory note in careful ink and folded them separately and tucked them in different places in her ledger for safekeeping, she sat for a moment at the desk in her room with the window open and the mountain air moving through the curtain. She had arrived here 11 days ago with a broken bag and no prospects and a town full of strangers who had watched her fall and not moved. She had arrived with $22 and a letter that turned out to be a lie. She had arrived with nothing she could call solid under her feet. She looked at the 3 copied documents on the desk. She looked at the mountain through the window, dark and enormous and absolutely there. She thought, I did not come all this way to be nobody. And something in her, some tightly wound, carefully maintained piece of herself that had been bracing against the world for 4 years. Let go just a little. Just enough. She put out the lamp and lay down in the dark, and for the first time since she'd left Selena, she did not lie awake for hours, going over everything she had done wrong and everything she still needed to fix. She simply closed her eyes. Outside, the mountain night was quiet and enormous and full of stars she had not yet learned the names of. She thought she might like to. She had made 3 copies of the promissory note. By morning, Caleb had read each one. I didn't say much at breakfast, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the way he sat across from her at the kitchen table with his coffee, going cold, turning the original document over in his hands, like a man trying to find a flaw in something that kept coming back clean. Raphael came in for a biscuit and looked between the two of them and read the room well enough to take his food back outside without being asked. You said Holloway's done this to others, Caleb said finally. I think so. The structure of the lien is too clean, too practiced. Evelyn poured herself more coffee. Someone sat down and drafted that document, knowing exactly what language to use and what to omit. That takes either a very good lawyer or a great deal of previous experience. Or both. Or both, she agreed. Do you know which ranches he's been moving on? Caleb set the document down. The Delaney spread south of town. Walt Delaney sold out in April, said he couldn't make the payments anymore. But Walt's ranch had good grass and a reliable well. I never understood why he couldn't make it work. Did you talk to him before he sold? Walt doesn't. He stopped. Walt didn't talk much after his wife passed. I should have checked in on him more than I did. He said it plainly without making it into a confession, but she heard the weight behind it. There's also the Pickett family, east of the ridge. Tom Pickett told me last month that he'd gotten papers he didn't understand from some Denver law firm. He was trying to get a lawyer in Ridgeline to look at them, but the only lawyer in Ridgeline is in Holloway's pocket, Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her. Raphael told me, she said. Yesterday. He didn't mean to. I was asking about town. The look on Caleb's face shifted into something that wasn't quite irritation and wasn't quite appreciation, a complicated middle ground that she was learning to read. Raphael talks too much. Raphael loves this ranch, she said. That's why he talks. He's scared. That landed. She watched it land. Caleb picked up his coffee, found it cold, and set it back down. I'll ride out to the Pickett place today, he said. See if Tom will show me those papers. I'll come with you. He looked up. I can read them faster than you can, she said not unkindly. And I know what to look for now. How was quiet for a moment. She had noticed that he never said no. Quickly he turned things over, first examined them, and then gave you his answer. And his answer usually held because of how long it had taken him to arrive at it. All right, he said. Be ready in an hour. Tom Pickett was a broad, sunburned man in his 50s, with the look of someone who had been steady his whole life and was now finding that steadiness wasn't enough. He met them at the fence line of his property and shook Caleb's hand and looked at Evelyn with the uncertain courtesy of a man who didn't quite know how to place her. This is Miss Carter, Caleb said. She's my bookkeeper. She's better with legal documents than either of us. Tom Pickett looked at her again. He made some kind of rapid internal calculation. Then he said, Well, come on in. The papers from the Denver law firm were on Tom's kitchen table, under a coffee mug that had been sitting on them long enough to leave a ring. Evelyn picked them up and began reading while Tom and Caleb stood awkwardly on either side of the table and talked about the summer grass and whether the creek was running low and other things neither of them was thinking about. It took her 6 minutes. Mr. Pickett, she said, did your father ever do business with a man named Harlan Holloway? Tom blinked. My grandfather, maybe. I couldn't say for certain. This claim refers to a debt from 1869, 15 years ago. She set the papers on the table and smoothed them flat. It uses the same language as the lien against Mr. Morgan's property, almost word for word. She looked at both men. Victor Holloway is running the same scheme across multiple ranches. He's using old debts that may have been paid off or may never have existed to file liens against land that has one thing in common. Water, Caleb said. Water, she confirmed. Your east pasture has the creek, Caleb. Mr. Pickett, what's the water situation on your land? Tom sat down slowly. Spring-fed pond in the north quarter. Never dries up, not even in drought years. His voice had gone flat and heavy. My grandfather dug it. Then that's what he wants, Evelyn said. The kitchen was very quiet. Tom looked at Caleb. I can't fight a Denver law firm. I've got 3 kids still at home. You don't have to fight them, Evelyn said, and both men looked at her. You have to prove the debt is fraudulent. That's different. She pulled her copy of the Holloway lien from her ledger. I found a receipt in Mr. Morgan's papers proving his father paid off the original debt 13 years ago. If there's a pattern here, if Holloway is targeting multiple ranches with the same false debt scheme, then we need to find as many records as we can. Old receipts, old letters, anything your grandfather or father kept. My mother kept everything, Tom said slowly. It's all in the attic. Then that's where we start. They were in Tom Pickett's attic for 3 hours. It was hot and close and smelled of old wood and decades of accumulated paper, and Evelyn went through every box while Tom and Caleb carried them down from the upper shelf and tried to stay out of her way. She found a church record, 2 decades of supply receipts, 3 years of bank correspondence, and 1 letter from 1872 that made her sit very still on the attic floor for a full minute before she called down the stairs. Caleb. He came up. He had to duck through the attic door. He looked at her face first. She'd learned that about him. He always checked faces before he checked situations, and then he crouched beside her. She held out the letter. It was from Harlan Holloway to Tom's grandfather, dated November 1872, acknowledging receipt of a final payment of $180 and declaring the debt between them settled in full. It was signed. It was witnessed. "He's been running this since his father's time," Caleb said quietly. "Or he inherited the files when his father died and saw an opportunity." Evelyn refolded the letter with care. "He has a list, Caleb. Names and amounts and properties. He's been working through it." "How many ranches?" "I don't know, but we need to find out." He looked at her for a moment. In the hot, cramped space of the attic with dust in the light between them, he had an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the closed, careful look of a man protecting himself, but something more open. Something that looked like the earliest stage of trust. "You're not going to drop this," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "Are you?" He took the letter from her carefully. "Let's go talk to Tom." Tom Pickett, when shown the letter, sat at his kitchen table for a long moment without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "My grandfather worked for 30 years to buy that land." And his voice didn't break, but it came close, and Evelyn looked at the table and gave him the moment he needed. Caleb put his hand on Tom's shoulder, a brief solid gesture, no words attached to it, and then stepped back. "We're going to need other ranchers," Caleb said. "If Holloway's running this scheme across the valley, there are others who've gotten papers. Some of them probably don't know what they mean." "Walt Delaney might already know," Tom said. "Walt sold out in April. He might know what he was up against." "Where is Walt now?" "Cousin's place up in Carbon County, last I heard." Tom looked between them. "You think he'd talk?" "I think," Caleb said, "that if someone had come to me before I spent 8 months carrying this alone, I would have talked." The weight of that sentence settled in the room. Evelyn watched Caleb's face as he said it, and saw something that she suspected he didn't often let show: the specific exhaustion of a man who had been fighting something quietly for too long alone, because asking for help was not a skill he'd ever learned. She understood that particular kind of tired. She understood it very well. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride out, which was saying something given how quiet Caleb always was. The sun was dropping behind the mountain, and the light had gone gold and long, and Evelyn sat beside him on the wagon bench with her ledger in her lap and said nothing until the ranch gate came into view. Then she said, "You should have told me about the lien sooner." He glanced at her. "You'd been here 11 days. I know, but you hired me to look at your books. The lien is in your books." She kept her voice even, not accusing, just stating. "If I'd found it 2 weeks later, we'd have 2 weeks less to work with." A pause. "You're right," he said. "I should have." She hadn't expected him to simply agree. Most men in her experience didn't simply agree when you told them they'd made a mistake. They explained or defended or changed the subject. Caleb Morgan said, "You're right," the way other men said, "Good morning," plainly without event. "All right," she said. "Miss Carter." "Evelyn." He looked at her sideways. "Evelyn." He said it carefully, like he was making sure he had it right. "There's something I haven't told you. About Holloway." He kept his eyes on the road. "He sent a man to the ranch, end of May, before I hired you. The man said Holloway wanted to buy me out, fair price, no trouble. Said the east parcel wasn't worth fighting over." "What did you say?" "I told him to get off my land." "And then, the next week, 2 of my summer calves turned up dead on the east slope." His jaw tightened fractionally. "Could have been coyotes. Could have been." The meaning of that sat between them for a moment. "He's not going to stop at the legal documents," she said. "No," Caleb said. He's not. She looked at the mountain. The last of the gold was leaving the peaks. Then we work faster, she said. Raphael was waiting at the barn when they pulled in, and he had the look of a man who had been trying to decide for several hours how to say something difficult. "Someone came while you were gone," he said. "Man from Ridgeline. Said he was delivering a message from Mr. Holloway." Caleb's voice went very flat. "What message?" Raphael reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. Caleb took it, read it, and then without a word handed it to Evelyn. It was brief, and it was clear. Victor Holloway was requesting that Caleb Morgan present himself at the Holloway office in Ridgeline no later than Friday of that week to discuss the terms of a buyout offer. The letter noted in language that was carefully polished to sound almost friendly that failure to appear would be taken as a declaration of intent to contest the lien, at which point the matter would be referred to the court in Cheyenne, where Mr. Holloway had retained counsel. Friday was 3 days away. "He's forcing your hand," Evelyn said. "He's been planning to," Caleb said. "He knew I'd find the lien eventually. He wanted to get ahead of it." "Then we get ahead of him first." She folded the letter and handed it back. "We need to talk to the other ranchers before Friday. Anyone who's gotten papers, anyone who sold out under pressure. We need every piece of evidence we can get." She looked at him steadily. "Can you get word to people before then? I can ride out tomorrow, hit 4 places by evening if I push." "I'll go with you." He looked at her, not with surprise exactly, but with that careful attention he gave things before he decided about them. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to." She met his eyes. "I want to." Something shifted in his face. Small. Barely there. But she was starting to learn the small shifts. "Be ready at first light," he said. They rode out before the sun was fully up. The first ranch was the Hartley place, 6 miles east, an older couple, the Hartleys who had gotten a letter from the Denver firm in March and had been too frightened to do anything with it. Vera Hartley met them at the door with the wariness of a woman who had been waiting for more bad news, and when Evelyn explained what they'd found and what it meant, the woman's wariness shifted into something that was half relief and half fury. "I knew it didn't feel right," Vera said. She went immediately to the bureau in the main room and produced a tin box from the second drawer. "Harold said we should pay it to be safe. I said don't you dare pay a cent on something you don't understand." She looked at her husband, who was sitting at the kitchen table looking embarrassed. "I told him." Harold Hartley was a large man who had the decency to look sheepish. "You told me," he allowed. The tin box had 20 years of correspondence in it, organized with the precision of a woman who had never trusted anyone else to find things. Evelyn went through it in 12 minutes and found what she needed, a receipt from 1868, signed by Harlan Holloway, acknowledging payment in full of a debt owed by Harold Hartley's father. Vera Hartley looked at the receipt and then looked at Evelyn with an expression that was moving rapidly toward fury. "He's been stealing from dead men," she said, "using the debts of dead men against their children." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Tell me what I can do." The second ranch didn't go as smoothly. Jim Cotter was 34, and afraid men, Evelyn had learned, often came out swinging before they figured out whether you were an enemy or not. He met them in his yard with his arms crossed and his face closed, and when Caleb introduced Evelyn, Cotter looked at her the way the man at the Ridgeline Depot had, like she was a complication he didn't have patience for. "I don't know why you'd bring a woman out here to talk about my legal troubles," Cotter said. Caleb's voice stayed even. "Because she's the one who found the fraud in the first place." "Fraud's a strong word." "It's the right word," Evelyn said. She kept her tone steady and professional, which was the only way she'd learned to get through conversations like this one. "Mr. Cotter, I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look at 2 documents side by side and tell me if you don't see what I see." Cotter looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Fine, show me." She laid the Morgan lien and the Hartley lien on the hood of his wagon side by side. She pointed to the language in each, the same phrases, the same clauses, the same carefully vague references to debts inherited by virtue of property succession. Cotter's arms uncrossed slowly without him seeming to notice. "He used almost the same sentence twice," Cotter said. "Right there, word for word." "Yes. That's—" He stopped. He looked at Caleb. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Caleb said. "It's not." Cotter's jaw worked for a moment. Then he went inside and came back with an envelope and held it out to Evelyn without a word. Inside was a lien notice 2 months old, filed against the 40 acres of his north pasture that contained the only reliable spring on his property. "I haven't told my wife," he said. His voice had gone rough. "She'd be sick over it. We got 3 kids. Evelyn put the envelope carefully in her ledger. "Do you have any old papers? Anything from your father's time?" "My father didn't keep much." He swallowed. "But my mother's sister might. She kept everything from when the family first settled here." "Will she talk to us?" Cotter looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him, steady and patient. "I'll bring you to her," Cotter said. The aunt. A small, sharp-eyed woman named Agnes, who lived alone and kept her house like a military operation, had a cedar chest under her bed that had not been opened in 15 years. She opened it for them without hesitation and stood back and let Evelyn go through it, which Evelyn appreciated more than she said. The evidence was in there. Not a receipt this time, but better a letter from Harlan Holloway himself, dated 1874, addressed to Cotter's grandfather, confirming the settlement of all outstanding accounts between them and wishing the family well on their continued settlement of the Wyoming Territory. It was written in the slightly formal, slightly florid language of a man who thought of himself as gracious, and it was worth its weight in gold. Agnes read it over Evelyn's shoulder. "Victor Holloway's father wrote that," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Agnes straightened up. "His father shook my brother-in-law's hand in this very town and called him a good man, and now his son is trying to steal from his grandchildren." Her voice was precise and cold and absolutely furious. "What do you need from me?" "Copies of this letter and your sworn statement that you found it in your family's possession," Evelyn said. "When the time comes." "You'll have it," Agnes said. "You'll have whatever you need." They ate a late midday meal at the Cotter place. Agnes refused to let them leave without food, and she had opinions about people who tried, and Evelyn sat at the table while Jim Cotter and Caleb talked and thought about what they had so far and what they still needed. 4 ranches. 4 fraudulent lions, traceable to the same scheme. 3 documented cases where the original debt had been cleared in writing. 1 sold-out ranch Delaney that might have the same paper trail if Walt Delaney had kept his father's records. It was enough to take to a court, maybe. But Holloway had the Ridgeline judge, and she knew it. They would need to go higher than Ridgeline. She was still working through it when she realized Cotter was talking to her. "You from back east?" he asked. Not unfriendly, just curious in the way of a man reassessing someone. "Kansas," she said. "What brings you out here to all this trouble?" She considered the question honestly. "I needed work," she said. "And I was better at finding it than staying safe." Cotter snorted not unkindly. "Sounds like half the people in this territory." Caleb across the table said nothing, but she felt him listening. The 3rd ranch was a near miss. The Olmsted place sat in a shallow valley 5 miles west of Cotter's, and when they rode in the yard, had the particular stillness of a property that had been recently vacated. The kitchen garden was unweeded. The house door was standing open. 2 horses were in the pasture looking unhappy about it. Caleb pulled the wagon up short. "Dan," he called. "Dan Olmsted." Silence. He climbed down and went to the house. Evelyn followed. The inside was not abandoned. There were dishes in the basin, clothes on the pegs, but it had the feeling of a place where something had shifted. A neighbor boy appeared from behind the barn, maybe 14, looking like he'd been put in charge of something he wasn't sure about. "Mr. Morgan, Mr. Olmsted's wife took sick this morning. He drove her into Ridgeline to the doctor. He said could someone watch the horses?" Caleb nodded. "Is she bad off?" "Don't know, sir." Caleb looked at the horses. He looked at the empty house. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded bill, which he handed to the boy without ceremony. You stay till he's back. Feed and water them at sundown." The boy took the money with wide eyes. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." They drove back to the main road in silence. After a while, Caleb said, "We'll have to come back." "I know," Evelyn said. "3 is enough to work with for now." She paused. "You gave that boy more than he asked for." "He didn't ask for anything," Caleb said. "Exactly." He glanced at her sideways. In that way he had brief measuring. She was beginning to think that the measure he was taking of her was going better than either of them expected. They made it back to the ranch in the early dark, and Raphael had supper ready and a look on his face that meant something had happened in their absence. "Man came again," Raphael said, before either of them were fully through the door. "Different man this time. Didn't give a name. He wanted to know if you'd hired on any new people recently." He looked at Evelyn. "Asked specifically if there was a woman staying here." The room went very quiet. Caleb's voice didn't rise. It never rose. But it went very level in a way she had learned meant something. "What did you tell him?" "I said I didn't know what he was talking about. That it was just you and me and the hands." Raphael's jaw was set. "He didn't believe me. He looked around the yard some. Then he left." Caleb turned to look at Evelyn. She was already looking at him. "Holloway's watching the ranch," she said. "He's watching for you," Caleb said. "He knows someone's been gathering information. The Hartleys must have—" He stopped. He shook his head. "Or Cotter. Or it could be someone in between. Or Holloway already had someone watching and they saw us today. Either way." He moved to the window and looked out into the dark. She knew he wasn't seeing anything. It was too dark for that, but he had the look of a man taking inventory of the distance between himself and something dangerous. "You need to be careful," he said without turning. "More careful than you've been." "I've been careful. I know." He turned. "I'm saying more." He held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment, she saw something that surprised her. Not just the protective instinct she'd have expected from any man in this situation, but something more specific and more personal. Concern. Real concern, the kind that had nothing to do with duty, and everything to do with actually minding whether something happened to someone. "This isn't just about the ranch anymore, Evelyn. If Holloway thinks you're a threat, then I'm a threat," she said steadily. "I'm not going to stop being one." His jaw worked. "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." She set her ledger on the kitchen table. "I know you're worried. I'm not dismissing that." She met his eyes. "But I've been careful my whole life, and careful kept me in a back room in Kansas, counting someone else's money for 3 years. I'm not interested in careful anymore." The kitchen was very still. Raphael was suddenly very busy with the supper pot. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she started to wonder if she'd gone too far, said too much, pushed against that closed-door quality in him once too often. Then he said quietly, "Fair enough." And something in the room eased. "Supper," Raphael said firmly, and put 3 bowls on the table. They sat up late that night, she and Caleb, after Raphael had gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch had gone quiet around them. She was making a proper record of everything they'd gathered, organizing by date, by ranch, by the name of the original creditor, while he sat across from her and went over the lean documents one more time. She'd noticed that he read slowly and carefully, the way a man reads something when he knows he can't afford to miss anything. He didn't apologize for it, and she didn't comment on it. At some point he said without looking up, "I haven't trusted anyone with this ranch in a long time." She kept writing. "I know. I'm not saying it's easy. I didn't think it was." She finished a line and looked up. "But you're doing it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes were on the document in front of him, but he wasn't reading anymore. "My father trusted the wrong person once. Cost him more than money." He set the paper down. "I made myself a rule after that. Don't trust quick. Don't trust without reason." "That's not a bad rule," she said. "You've given me reason," he said plainly. Like it was a simple fact, he was reporting, not a compliment, he was offering. She looked at him. He looked back directly, without the layers of reserve he usually wore, and it was like a window coming open. After a long time closed, the air that came through it was unexpectedly clear. "Don't make it into more than it is," she said, because she'd spent a lifetime learning not to assume things meant what she wanted them to mean. "I'm not," he said. "I'm just telling you the truth." He picked up the document again. "I reckon you deserve that." She looked down at her ledger. Her handwriting on the page was perfectly even, perfectly controlled. It had taken her years to make it that way, years of practicing steadiness, so nobody would ever see her hands shake. "Friday is 2 days out," she said. "I know. We need Walt Delaney's records if we can get them. And we need someone in Cheyenne, a lawyer or a federal official who isn't in Holloway's pocket." "I know a man," Caleb said. "Federal Land Office. He was posted in Ridgeline 5 years ago. Straight as they come. He moved to Cheyenne when the posting ended." "Can you reach him before Friday?" "I can wire him in the morning." She nodded. She wrote it down. They sat across from each other in the lamplight with the documents between them and the mountain dark outside the window, and neither of them said anything more for a while. But the silence between them had changed. It wasn't the silence of two strangers keeping careful distance anymore. It was something else, something that had been quietly becoming itself while neither of them was quite watching. It was the silence of two people who had started without deciding to trust each other with the hard things. Outside, the summer wind moved through the pines on the mountain. Inside, the lamp burned steady. Evelyn Carter kept writing. The wire went out to Cheyenne at 7 in the morning. Caleb had ridden into Ridgeline before sunrise, before anyone who might be watching would think to watch, and sent the message to Daniel Hess at the Federal Land Office in 12 words. Evidence of systematic land fraud. Multiple properties. Need your eyes. Urgent. He was back at the ranch before the hands had finished their morning feed, and he told Evelyn what he'd done over coffee, the way a man reports a decision already made. Not asking for approval. Just keeping her informed. She appreciated that more than she said. "Now we wait," she said. "Now we move," he said. "Waiting is what Holloway wants us doing." He was right, and she knew it. The wire might take a day to reach Hess, and another day to get a response. Friday was coming, whether they were ready or not. So they split the morning between them. Caleb rode south to find Walt Delaney's cousin's address from a man in town who owed him a favor, and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and did what she did best. She built a case. She organized everything they had into a single document dated and sourced. The Morgan promissory note paid in full in 1874. The Hartley receipt. The Pickett letter. The Cotter settlement confirmation from Agnes. 4 separate instances of Victor Holloway. Filing lines against properties where the underlying debt had already been cleared in writing with the Holloway signature on the release. She cross-referenced the language in each lien document and wrote out in plain numbered points exactly where the fraudulent claims diverged from the legitimate records. When she finished, she read it back to herself. Then she read it again. It was good. It was very good. Any competent federal officer who read this document would understand immediately what had happened and who had done it. The problem was getting it in front of someone competent and federal before Friday. Caleb came back before noon with an address. Walt Delaney was at his cousin's place in Hannah, 40 miles north. Too far to ride and return before Friday. But Caleb had also come back with something else, a piece of information that landed on the kitchen table between them like a stone. "Holloway's called a meeting," Caleb said. "Tonight, at the Ridgeline Saloon. Invited all the ranchers in the valley." Evelyn looked up. "Why?" "Officially to discuss a new water management proposal. He's been floating it around some cooperative agreement where everyone contributes access to their water sources in exchange for guaranteed supply in dry years." Caleb's jaw was tight. "It sounds reasonable. That's the point. And unofficially, he wants to see who's talking to who. And he wants to make me a public offer in front of witnesses, so I look unreasonable for refusing." She saw it immediately. "If you turn him down in public, he controls the story. You're the difficult one. You're the man holding up progress for the whole valley." "That's it exactly. Are you going to go?" He looked at her steadily. "Are you?" The question surprised her, the assumption in it, the way he asked it, as though her presence was already part of his plan. She held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said. Something settled in his face. "Good. Because I need someone in that room who can hear what's being said underneath what's being said." "And what does that mean for us before tonight?" He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "It means we finish what you're building. And it means you tell me exactly what to say when Holloway makes his offer." Raphael drove them into Ridgeline that evening. He'd argued to come, not loudly. Raphael rarely did anything loudly, but with the quiet persistence of a man who had made up his mind, and Caleb had let him on the condition that he stayed with the wagon and kept his eyes open. Raphael had agreed to this with a dignity that suggested he thought it was a reasonable division of responsibility. The Ridgeline Saloon was fuller than Evelyn had ever seen a room in this territory. Every rancher in the valley seemed to have come men she recognized from the previous day's ride. Men she'd never seen, older men and younger men, and two women who had come with their husbands and sat straight-backed in chairs along the wall. The room smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and the particular nervous energy of people who knew something important was happening, but weren't certain yet what side of it they were on. Victor Holloway was at the front of the room. She had built a picture of him in her mind, from documents and descriptions, and the picture had been of something larger and more menacing than the man who actually stood there. Holloway was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the way of a man who wore good clothes as a statement of what he believed about himself, with silver at his temples, and the practiced warm manner of someone who had spent decades making people feel at ease before taking something from them. He was flanked by two men in suits, lawyers, she guessed, and a third man who had the look of someone whose job was not legal. She sat down beside Caleb near the back of the room and watched Holloway work the crowd before the meeting even started. He knew names. He asked after children and harvests and sick wives with the fluency of a man who had done his research carefully. He laughed at the right moments. He touched people's arms. "He's good," she said quietly. "He's very good." Caleb agreed at the same volume. "Don't let that surprise you tonight." "Hasn't surprised me yet." Holloway called the meeting to order with the easy authority of a man who was used to being the most important person in any room he entered. He outlined the proposal, the Ridgeline Valley Water Cooperative, he called it, with the kind of measured, reasonable language that made its opponents sound like they were afraid of progress. Every rancher who joined would contribute water access agreements for their key sources. In return, the cooperative would maintain infrastructure-managed distribution in dry years and protect everyone against the kind of seasonal shortages that had hurt the valley 3 summers running. It sounded, Evelyn had to admit, almost sensible, if you didn't know what she knew. She watched the room as Holloway talked. She watched faces shift from wariness to interest to something that was almost persuaded. She watched Tom Pickett 3 rows ahead, sitting very still with his hands on his knees. She watched the Hartleys near the sidewall, Vera, with her arms folded, and Harold slightly less certain beside her. She watched a dozen men she didn't know begin to nod slowly, the way people nod when something is confirming what they were already half inclined to believe. Holloway finished his presentation. He opened the floor. The first 3 questions were soft, clarifying questions, practical questions, the questions of men who were already most of the way to yes. Holloway answered each one with the warm confidence of a man on familiar ground. Then a man in the back stood up. Not Caleb, a rancher. Evelyn didn't recognize, weathered and deliberate. "What happens to the water rights if a member can't make his payments to the cooperative?" he asked. A brief pause. Very brief. Most people probably didn't notice it. Evelyn noticed it. "In that scenario," Holloway said smoothly, "the cooperative would have the right to assume temporary management of the relevant water source until the member's account was current." "Temporary management," the man repeated. "Exactly. Who decides when the account is current?" "The cooperative board." "Who's on the board?" Another small pause. "Initially the founding members, which would include the cooperative's primary investor, myself, along with elected representatives from the valley ranches." "So you," the man said. Holloway smiled. "Among others." The man sat down. He didn't look satisfied, but he didn't push further, and Holloway was already moving toward his conclusion. his voice warm and inclusive, talking about legacy and community and the kind of future they could build together in this valley. That was when Caleb stood up. The room shifted. Not dramatically, just the small shift of a room when someone unexpected does something. Caleb Morgan was known here. She could feel that in the way people's posture changed. Not fear, recognition. "I have a question about the water access agreements," Caleb said. His voice was level and carried cleanly through the room. Holloway's warm manner didn't waver. "Mr. Morgan, of course. The agreements, would they cover all major water sources on a member's property, including sources that are currently the subject of legal disputes?" A beat. Holloway's lawyers exchanged a glance. "Legal disputes would need to be resolved before a member's full water access could be formally registered," Holloway said. "It's simply a matter of clear title. And if a member believed a claim against their water source was fraudulent," Caleb said, "would the cooperative agreement affect their standing to contest it?" The room had gone very still. Holloway's smile stayed on his face, but something behind it had changed, a tightening very slight around the eyes. "That would be a matter for the courts to determine." "The courts in Ridgeline," Caleb said, "or the federal court in Cheyenne." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This silence had weight. Holloway looked at Caleb with the practiced patience of a man who was accustomed to diffusing opposition in public. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Morgan." "I'm not implying anything," Caleb said. "I'm asking a question about jurisdiction." "Then I'd suggest you consult a lawyer." "I intend to," Caleb said, and he sat down. People looked at them as they filed out, not hostile, curious. Vera Hartley caught Evelyn's eye as she passed and gave her a look that said, "Well done," without saying anything at all. Tom Pickett appeared at Caleb's shoulder on the way out the door. "You poked him," Tom said quietly. "I poked him," Caleb agreed. "He's not going to like that." "No." But now everyone in that room heard the word fraudulent in connection with Victor Holloway, and that seed's going to grow whether he likes it or not. Caleb kept walking. "That's enough for tonight." Evelyn said nothing. She was watching the two lawyers who were talking to Holloway near the front of the room, in the posture of men being given instructions. She was watching the third man, the one who was not a lawyer, and he was watching Caleb. She put her hand briefly on Caleb's arm. He stopped. "The man on Holloway's left," she said quietly. "Don't look, he's watching you." Caleb didn't look. "I've seen him before. He rode the Ridgeline in May." "Then he knows the ranch." "Yes." They walked out. The wire from Daniel Hess arrived the next morning. Raphael brought it up from the Ridgeline where the messenger had left it tied to the fence post. Caleb had arranged for messages to come in that way off the main road, and he came into the kitchen with it while Evelyn was eating breakfast and Caleb was still outside. She read it before he came in. She read it twice. When Caleb came through the door, she held it out. He read it. His face didn't change in any dramatic way, but something in his posture shifted, a release of some tension he'd been holding since the meeting, since the lean, maybe longer. Hess's message was brief. "Received your wire. Aware of Holloway operations. Have evidence of my own. Can be in Ridgeline by Saturday. Do not appear at his office Friday. Repeat, do not appear." "Saturday," Caleb said. "He's already been watching Holloway," Evelyn said. "We're not the only ones." Which means we're not alone in this." She picked up her coffee. "And it means Friday is a trap." Caleb set the wire on the table. "Holloway wants me to show up and either accept his offer or contest the lien on his terms in a room he controls before a judge. He controls before we can get any of our evidence in front of a federal officer." He looked at her. "If I don't appear, he files against me in Cheyenne without our evidence in hand. But Hess is already coming with his own evidence." She leaned forward. "Caleb, if Holloway is trying to push you into a Friday confrontation, specifically, it's because he knows something's moving at the federal level. He's trying to get ahead of it. He found out about the wire. Or he found out about Hess independently. Either way." She stopped. He was already looking at her. "Raphael," Caleb said. I went to the door. Raphael was in the yard near the water pump, And when Caleb called him, he came immediately with the careful alertness of a young man who had spent the last week sensing that something was building. "Who knew I sent a wire yesterday?" Caleb asked. Raphael's face went through something complicated. "The man at the telegraph, that's all." He hesitated. "But Mr. Morgan, the man who came asking questions Tuesday. I think he talked to the telegraph operator before he came here. I saw him coming from that direction." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "How long has Holloway had someone in that office?" "I don't know, sir. A long time, maybe." "All right." He looked at Evelyn. "He knows Hess is coming. Then Friday isn't just a trap for you," she said. "It's a move to discredit us before Saturday. He wants this case settled before the federal officer arrives." She was thinking fast, and she could feel it in her own voice, the urgency, the pieces clicking together. "He's going to try to get a judgment against your ranch Friday morning. Have it recorded before Hess gets here. Make it a done deal." "Can he do that fast?" "If his judge signs it, and it's on record before a federal officer contests it, it creates a procedural tangle that could take months to unravel, even if Hess has evidence." She met his eyes. "We have to get our documents to Hess before Friday, not wait for him to arrive Saturday. He's 40 miles away. Then we need to send someone tonight." They looked at each other. "I'll go," Raphael said from the doorway. Both of them turned. Raphael was standing straight, his hat in his hands, with the look of someone who had made a decision and was not going to be argued out of it. "You're not," Caleb started. "I know this territory better than anyone you could hire, and I'm faster than you on the Appaloosa, and you know both of those things." Raphael looked at him steadily. "Let me go." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands. He looked at Raphael. And Evelyn watched something move through his face, the particular conflict of a man who had spent years keeping people at arm's length for their own safety, and was now being asked for the third time in as many weeks to let someone take a risk on his behalf. "Take the Appaloosa," Caleb said. "Don't stop in Ridgeline. Go around." Raphael put his hat on. "I'll be back by morning." "Not if you're careful, you won't. Stay in Hannah if it's too dark to ride back. I mean it." Raphael nodded and went. They listened to the Appaloosa leave the yard at a canter. What followed was the longest afternoon of Evelyn's life, and she had had some long afternoons. She worked. It was the only thing she knew how to do when fear was sitting in the room with her. She turned it into motion, into precision, into something that had a result she could measure. She made a final copy of every document. She organized them in order of legal weight. She wrote a cover letter addressed to Daniel Hess at the Federal Land Office, laying out the case in clean, careful language, and she made a copy of that too. Caleb stayed close to the ranch. He did the work of the day, the animals, the fence line, the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running, but she could see that he was listening. Every sound that came from the road, every shift in the horses registered in the slight change of his attention. Late in the afternoon, he came in from outside and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. He was dusty and tired, and he looked like a man carrying the specific weight of someone who had built something with his hands and was watching someone else try to take it. "My father built this barn," he said without preamble. She looked up from the table. "He and 3 other men. Took them 2 weeks." He leaned against the doorframe. "He used to say that the only things worth having were the things you made with your own labor, because no one could argue you hadn't earned them." He paused. "I was wrong about some things, but he wasn't wrong about that." "No," she said. "He wasn't." He came to the table and sat down. He looked at the stack of documents she'd organized, and she could tell he was seeing not the papers, but what they represented, the years, the work, the inherited weight of something his father had started, and he had continued alone. "When this is over," he said slowly, "one way or another, what do you plan to do?" The question came from somewhere sideways, and it landed with more weight than he'd probably intended. She looked at him carefully. "I haven't thought that far." "You should." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table, work roughened and very still. "Because you're too capable to be a bookkeeper on a mountain ranch forever," he said. "And I reckon you know that." He met her eyes. I'm not trying to get rid of you. I'm telling you that I'm aware of it. I appreciate the honesty, she said. I'm not being honest to be kind. I'm being honest because you deserve it. He paused. You've been honest with me. From the first day. She thought about that. She thought about the telegram to Gerald Fitch that had not mentioned she was a woman. She thought about all the strategic omissions that had gotten her this far. Not entirely, she said. He looked at her. I didn't tell Gerald Fitch I was a woman, or 18. She said it plainly. I knew they might not hire me if they knew. He held her gaze for a moment. Did you lie about the skills? No. Then you were honest about what mattered. He looked at his hands. I've done the same. Emphasized what served me, and kept quiet about the rest. A pause. I reckon everyone does. Some more than others. Holloway more than most. His jaw tightened. He's not going to take this quietly. When Hess comes and the case goes federal, he's going to push back. Hard. I know. I need you to understand that things might get worse before they get better. He looked at her directly with that open window quality she'd come to recognize as his version of vulnerability. I don't want you to be caught off guard. I'm not easily caught off guard, she said. I know that about you, he said. I'm saying it anyway. The afternoon light through the kitchen window was long and warm, and the ranch was quiet around them. And for a moment, the threat of Victor Holloway and the Friday deadline and the missing Raphael seemed very far away. She said, Why did you stop me from falling in Ridgeline? He blinked. What? That first day. You could have walked past. Most people did. She held his gaze. Why didn't you? I was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she wondered if she'd overstepped. Then he said, My mother died when I was 12, coming home from town on her own. Fell from the wagon on a bad road and lay there until morning because nobody stopped. He said it without self-pity, just stating the geography of something that had shaped him. I decided when I was 15 that I would always stop, no matter what. The kitchen was very still. I'm sorry about your mother, she said. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it shorter, she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face, not all the way to the surface, but close enough to see. No, he said quietly. It doesn't. The trouble came at dusk. She heard the horses first, more than one coming fast up the ranch road, and she was at the window before Caleb was off his chair. 3 riders, coming hard. Caleb was at the door with his rifle before she'd finished processing what she was seeing, and he stepped out onto the porch with the quiet, coiled readiness of a man who had been waiting for exactly this and had decided not to be afraid of it. The riders pulled up at the yard gate. The front man was the one from the saloon, the man who had been watching Caleb, the one who had ridden the ridge in May. He had 2 others behind him. Morgan, he called. Mr. Holloway wants those documents, the woman's papers. Caleb didn't move. His voice carried across the yard without effort. Tell Mr. Holloway that any legal matter can be addressed through proper channels. He's not asking through channels. The man's horse shifted. He's asking through me. Then the answer's no. A silence. The man looked at the 2 behind him. When he looked back, something in his manner had shifted, harder, flatter. You're making a mistake, he said. I've made plenty, Caleb said. This isn't one of them. The man looked at the house. He was looking for her, she realized, trying to see through the window, trying to assess where the papers were. She stepped back from the glass. Last chance, the man said. I heard you the first time, Caleb said. Get off my property. The standoff held for 20 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then the man turned his horse and the 3 of them went back down the road at a walk. Not the fast retreat of men who were done, but the measured departure of men who were shifting to a different plan. Caleb came back inside. He didn't look shaken. He looked resolved, the specific quality of a man who has committed to something and feels the simplicity of that commitment like solid ground. They'll be back, Evelyn said. Yes. He set the rifle against the wall. Tonight. Then we move the documents. He looked at her. Where? She had already thought about this. She pulled the ledger from the table and looked at it, this battered, overstuffed, completely indispensable ledger that had traveled from Kansas with her and now contained the evidence that could bring down Victor Holloway's entire operation. "Vera Hartley," she said. "She's 10 miles away, and Holloway won't expect it. She's already agreed to help. I'll ride." "I'll ride," she said. "You need to stay here. If they come back and find the ranch empty, they'll burn it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something complex and layered and more personal than anything he'd shown her before. "Evelyn." "I know the road," she said. "I've ridden it twice, and I'll take your second horse, the fast one. That's not what I—" He stopped. He took a breath. He looked at his hands and then at her, and she could see him making the same calculation he'd made at the kitchen table, and every time before that, weigh the risk, make the decision, hold to it. "You come back before full dark. You don't stop. You don't detour." "I know." "And you take the rifle." "I'm not a good shot. Nobody needs to know that." He said it with such flat certainty that something in her chest wound tight for 3 weeks, released by a fraction. "Take it anyway." She took it. She was at the barn door when he called after her. "Evelyn." She turned. He was standing in the yard, tall and still, with the mountain behind him, and the dusk turning everything, the color of old copper. And he had an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of the ride, and probably longer than that. "Come back," he said. Simple. 2 words. Not an order, not a question. Just the truth of what he wanted, said plainly, by a man who had spent years not saying such things plainly. She looked at him for one moment. "I will," she said. And she rode. Vera Hartley met her at the fence line with a lantern, and no questions, took the ledger with both hands like someone receiving something sacred, and said only, "I'll put it in the bread box under the floor. Harold built it when the Sioux troubles came through. Nobody's found it in 12 years. "Don't tell anyone it's there," Evelyn said. "Child," Vera said with the patient authority of a woman who had been keeping secrets since before Evelyn was born. "I didn't tell Harold where I keep the household money, and we've been married 31 years. Go back to that man of yours. He's worried." She started to say, "He's not my man," and then she thought about 2 words, said plainly in a darkening yard, and she said nothing at all. She rode back fast, and the stars were just coming out when she turned through the ranch gate. Caleb was on the porch. He stood when he heard the horse, and the particular tension in his posture when he saw her, the release of it, the specific way his shoulders dropped by a fraction, told her more than he probably intended. She dismounted. She walked the horse to the fence. She looked at him. "Documents are safe," she said. "Good." He came down the porch steps. He stopped 2 feet from her. In the dark, with the summer air between them, he was close enough that she could see the tiredness in his face and the relief underneath it. "You're all right. I told you I would be. I know you did." He didn't step back. "I'm still glad you are." They stood like that for a moment. The mountain dark around them, the ranch quiet, the crisis still 1 day away, and the 2 of them standing in the narrow space between what they'd survived and what was still coming, and neither of them moved. Then somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and stamped, and the moment released. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. They went inside. Raphael came back before dawn. Evelyn heard the Appaloosa in the yard, and was at the window before she was fully awake, and she saw Caleb already on the porch, which meant he hadn't slept either, or hadn't slept much, which she supposed was true of both of them. Raphael dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had ridden 40 miles in the dark, and was feeling every one of them, and he handed Caleb a folded envelope before he'd even caught his breath. She was at the door by the time Caleb opened it. Hess had written back in his own hand, this time, not a wire, a full letter, which meant Raphael had waited while the man wrote it. Caleb read it once and handed it to Evelyn without a word. Daniel Hess had been building a file on Victor Holloway for 14 months. He had evidence from 3 counties, not just Ridgeline, but Carbon and Albany too. He had affidavits from 2 ranchers who had already sold out under pressure and were willing to testify. He had a correspondence chain between Holloway and a Denver law firm that documented in writing the deliberate strategy of identifying old debt records and using them to manufacture fraudulent liens. He was not coming Saturday. He had moved his departure up. He would be in Ridgeline by Friday noon. And he was not coming alone. He was bringing a deputy U.S. Marshal. Evelyn read it twice. Then she looked up at Caleb. "He's been building this case for over a year," she said. "We handed him exactly what he was missing," Caleb said. "Local documentation, ranchers willing to stand together." His voice was even, but she could hear something underneath it, the specific quality of a man who had been carrying a fight alone and has just been told he wasn't alone after all. Raphael, leaning against the porch post with his arms crossed, said, "So what do we do now?" Caleb looked at the letter. He looked at Evelyn. "We go to Ridgeline," he said. "All of us. And we make sure Holloway can't move before noon." The plan was simple, which Evelyn had learned to be suspicious of. Simple plans had a way of becoming complicated the moment they met real circumstances. But simple was what they had time for. Holloway expected Caleb to appear at his office Friday morning to either accept the buyout or formally contest the lien triggering the local court process he controlled. What Holloway did not know, or so they had to assume, was that a federal officer and a U.S. Marshal were riding toward Ridgeline from Cheyenne. The window was narrow. Keep Holloway occupied, keep him from filing anything before Hess arrived, get every rancher with evidence into one room. Caleb sent word before sunrise. He rode out himself to Tom Pickett first, then to the Hartleys. He sent one of his ranch hands to the Cotter place. He trusted no one at the telegraph and nothing to written messages. Every conversation was face-to-face. Evelyn retrieved the ledger from Vera Hartley's bread box while Caleb was still writing, and she organized it one final time at the kitchen table, everything in order, everything sourced the cover letter to Hess on top. She was ready. She had been ready for 3 days. What she was not ready for was what Raphael found when he went into Ridgeline ahead of them to read the temperature of the town. He came back at 8 in the morning with a look on his face that she'd learned to dread, the look of a man who had found something worse than he expected. "Holloway's called a court session for 9 o'clock, Raphael said. "This morning. He went to Judge Crane last night. He's filing a foreclosure action on the east parcel." Caleb's expression went very still. "He moved it up. He knows about Hess," Evelyn said. Her voice came out flat and certain. "He found out. He's trying to get the judgment recorded before noon." She was already on her feet, already calculating. If he gets a foreclosure judgment on record before the federal officer arrives. "It complicates everything," Caleb said. "Even with Hess's evidence. We have to get to that courtroom. We can't stop a legal proceeding. We can't stop it," she said. "But we can be in the room when it happens, with every rancher who has evidence and every document we've gathered." She met his eyes. "Holloway wants this done in an empty room with a judge who owes him money. We're going to fill that room." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was harsh and clear, and she could see the tiredness in his face and the resolve underneath it, and something else. Something that had been building for 3 weeks and was now in this urgent and graceless moment entirely visible. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "Women can't be lawyers," she said. "That's a damn waste," he said, and reached for his hat. They rode into Ridgeline at 8:40. There were more people on the main street than a Friday morning warranted, and Evelyn understood immediately that word had gotten out, not all of it, and not correctly, but enough. People stood in front of the general store, and the feed merchant, and the hotel, watching them come in. The way people in small towns watch when they sense something is about to happen that will be talked about for years. Tom Pickett was already there with his wife, and his wife had brought her sister. The Hartleys were there, Harold looking determined, and Vera looking like she had been determined since birth. Jim Cotter came around the corner of the livery, with his Aunt Agnes beside him, and Agnes had a folder of documents under her arm and the expression of a woman going into battle. 7 ranchers in total plus wives, and in one case, a grown son. The street outside the courthouse was more crowded than Holloway had planned for. Caleb tied his horse and stood for a moment looking at the people who had come. He wasn't a man who showed emotion easily or publicly, But something moved through his face as he looked at them, a gratitude that ran too deep for his voice to carry it safely, so he didn't try. Tom Pickett said quietly, "What do we do?" "We go in," Caleb said.
Sure.
Judge Crane was a small, dry man who had the look of someone who had been sitting behind a bench for so long that the bench had started to shape him. He looked up when the courtroom door opened, and his expression cycled through surprise, irritation, and something that might have been alarm in the space of about 2 seconds. Because behind Caleb came Tom Pickett and Vera Hartley and Jim Cotter's Aunt Agnes, and 11 other people who had no legal reason to be there, and every moral reason to be there, and absolutely no intention of leaving. Victor Holloway was already seated at the front table. His 2 lawyers were with him. The third man, the one who wasn't a lawyer, was standing by the side door, and when Evelyn walked in, his eyes went straight to the ledger under her arm. She looked back at him steadily and sat down. Holloway turned in his chair when the room kept filling. His polished manner was intact, but around the edges something had tightened. He had expected an empty courtroom and a rubber stamp. He had gotten a room full of people who had driven miles in the early morning to be here, and their presence said something that no legal argument could say as cleanly. Judge Crane cleared his throat. "This is a closed proceeding on the matter of the Holloway lien against Parcel 12 of the Ridgeline." "It's not a closed proceeding," Evelyn said. The room went perfectly quiet. Judge Crane stared at her. "I beg your pardon." She stood. She was 18 years old, and she was the only woman in the room who wasn't seated against the wall, and she felt every eye in the place find her and hold, and she kept her voice clear and her hands still. "Civil lion proceedings in Wyoming Territory are matters of public record. Your Honor and members of the public have the right to attend. I'd be happy to cite the statute if you need the reference." She would not be happy to cite the statute because she had read it once 2 days ago and could not guarantee she had the exact wording. But she said it like she could cite it in her sleep because that was what this moment required. Crane's eyes went to Holloway. Holloway's jaw had tightened by a fraction. She could see it from across the room. One of his lawyers leaned in and said something she couldn't hear. "The proceedings will continue," Crane said with the stiff dignity of a man reclaiming ground. "Be seated." She sat. Caleb beside her said nothing, but under the table, briefly, his hand found her wrist. Not a romantic gesture, just a solid and deliberate, "I see what you did," and then it was gone. Holloway's lawyer was good. She had to grant him that. He presented the lien documentation with the measured confidence of a man who had done this before and expected the machinery to work the way it always had. He cited the debt, the original, 1969 note, the succession clause, the Morgan property as collateral. He submitted the lien as Exhibit 1. He spoke about the legal tradition of inherited debt with the authority of someone who had carefully selected which traditions to cite. When he finished, Judge Crane looked at Caleb. "Mr. Morgan, you have the right to respond." Caleb stood. He was not a man of legal language, he knew that about himself, so he didn't pretend to be. "Your Honor, the debt this lien is based on was paid in full in 1874. I have the receipt signed by Harlan Holloway himself." He handed the promissory note, the original stamped "paid in full," to the court clerk. The lawyer for Holloway said, without missing a beat, "The authenticity of that document has not been verified." "I'd like to verify it," said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Daniel Hess was standing in the doorway. He was a compact man in his 40s, unremarkable looking, in the way of someone who had cultivated unremarkability professionally, and beside him was a younger man with a badge on his coat that caught the light when he stepped forward. The deputy, U.S. Marshal. They were 2 hours early. Holloway went completely still. It was the stillness of a man whose plan has just changed shape entirely, who is rapidly recalculating and finding the numbers do not come out in his favor. His lawyers exchanged a glance. The third man by the side door shifted his weight. Judge Crane looked between Hess and Holloway with the expression of a man who has just realized the bridge he is standing on belongs to someone else. Hess walked to the front of the room with the unhurried authority of a federal officer who was entirely comfortable in courtrooms and had been in considerably more serious ones than this. He set a leather case on the table beside Caleb and opened it. "Daniel Hess, Federal Land Office, Cheyenne," he said. "I am here in an official capacity regarding an ongoing federal investigation into fraudulent land and water rights claims in Carbon, Albany, and Converse counties." He looked at Judge Crane. "Your Honor, I'd recommend suspending this proceeding pending review of federal evidence that directly pertains to the claim before you." Crane's mouth opened, then it closed. Holloway's lawyer was on his feet. "This is highly irregular. A local proceeding cannot be interrupted by a federal investigation." The marshal's voice was quiet and had the quality of someone who rarely needed to raise it. "Sir, I'd like to see your license to practice in Wyoming territory." The courtroom erupted. It took 20 minutes to restore order, and in those 20 minutes, Evelyn sat very still and watched Victor Holloway. She watched him speak rapidly to his lawyers. She watched the calculation running behind his eyes, the same calculation she'd seen running in the eyes of men who realized the ground had shifted and were trying to find new footing. She watched him look at the crowd of ranchers who had shown up and understand for the first time that this was not going to be contained the way he had intended. He turned and looked directly at her. She did not look away. He held her gaze for a moment. There was no warmth in it. There had never been warmth in Victor Holloway's face. When the mask slipped, just the cold assessment of someone who had spent his life treating people as obstacles or instruments. He looked at her with that assessment weighing her, finding her. She could see him finding her more significant than he'd anticipated. Then he looked away first. She let herself breathe. Caleb beside her said very quietly, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "You, ask me when this is over." Hess requested a formal continuance of the proceeding pending federal review. Crane granted it. He would have been a fool not to, with a deputy marshal in the room, and the language of the grant was careful and complete, and left Holloway's lien exactly where it had been, unresolved, unrecorded as a judgment, and now under federal scrutiny. It was not a victory. It was not over. But it was enough for today. The courtroom emptied in stages. Holloway left first with his lawyers, and nobody spoke to him on his way out, because the room had a sense of what had happened, and it was not the outcome he had arranged. The ranchers filed out into the morning, with the particular quiet of people who have done something significant and are still processing the size of it. Tom Pickett shook Caleb's hand on the courthouse steps without saying anything. The Hartleys did the same. Jim Cotter's Aunt Agnes patted Evelyn on the arm and said, "You did good, girl," with the matter-of-fact delivery of the highest compliment Agnes was capable of giving. Hess found them outside. He shook Caleb's hand and then looked at Evelyn with the appraising attention of a man who assessed things for a living. "You built the case document," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "It is the most organized local evidence file I've seen in 14 months of this investigation." He said it plainly, the same way Caleb said things, as information, not flattery. "I'll need you to be available for the federal proceeding. It'll be in Cheyenne. Could be 6 weeks, could be 8. "She'll be available," Caleb said. She looked at him. "If that's what you want," he said to her with a slight correction in his voice, acknowledging that he'd spoken for her without asking. "I should have put that as a question." "It's what I want," she said. Hess nodded. "Good." He looked between them with the brief, practical assessment of a man who noticed things and filed them. "I'll be at the hotel through Monday. Come find me this afternoon, both of you. I need full statements." He left. They stood on the courthouse steps in the full heat of the Friday morning, and the street was returning to its ordinary business around them. And Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, the specific, unfamiliar sensation of ground that wasn't moving under her feet. The afternoon was long and procedural and exhausting, in the way that legal processes always were. Statements given carefully, documents reviewed, everything recorded in the flat, precise language of federal documentation that felt very far from the urgency of the last 3 days. Hess was thorough. He asked questions she hadn't anticipated, and some that she had, and he followed threads she'd thought were tangential into evidence that turned out to matter significantly. By the time he finished with her, she had been talking for 2 hours, and her hand ached from signing documents, and she was deeply grateful when his assistant brought in a tray of coffee, and she could simply sit for 5 minutes and not speak. Caleb was in the adjacent room giving his own statement. She could hear his voice through the wall, low, even unhurried, and the sound of it was steadying in a way she didn't examine too carefully. The twist came at 4 in the afternoon. Hess came back in with a different expression, not alarm exactly, but the heightened attention of a man who has found something unexpected. He set a document on the table between them and looked at her. "Do you recognize this name?" he asked and pointed. She looked. The document was a deed transfer dated 3 months prior. The property was the Delaney Ranch, Walt Delaney's land, sold under pressure in April. The buyer was listed as a holding company. The registered agent for that holding company was a man named Gerald Fitch. The room went very quiet inside her head. Gerald Fitch. The man who had signed her letter. The man who had promised her a job at the Hargrove operation, and whose departure had sent her penniless and 18 into the streets of Ridgeline on the day Caleb Morgan had stopped to pick up her Bible. "I know that name," she said. Her voice came out very steady. "He's the reason I came to Wyoming." Hess looked at her carefully. "Fitch is Holloway's legal agent in Denver. Has been for 3 years. The Hargrove operation was one of several holding companies Holloway used to move acquired properties." He paused, watching her face. "The job offer you received was likely manufactured. Hargrove's operation was real once, but by the time that letter was written, it had been folded into Holloway's network." The magnitude of it settled over her slowly. She had not ended up in Ridgeline by chance. She had not walked out of that stagecoach by accident or bad luck. Someone Holloway's network. Fitch had been circulating false employment offers to draw workers, or perhaps specifically bookkeepers, to failed operations in the territory. She didn't know why. She didn't know if she had been specifically targeted or simply one of many. But the coincidence was not a coincidence. She had been placed here, not by Caleb Morgan, not by kindness, by the same machine she'd spent 3 weeks fighting. Hess said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "What does it mean legally?" He blinked. He'd expected a different reaction, she could see that. "It means Fitch is implicated in the larger fraud. It means the web is wider than we thought." He looked at her steadily. "It may mean you were brought here deliberately, Miss Carter. We don't know to what end yet." She thought about it with the cold, clear part of her mind that worked best under pressure. Holloway had been acquiring ranches. He had been building a water monopoly. He had needed someone inside the operations. He was targeting someone who could assess the financial records and report back on what was there. Someone like a bookkeeper. "He wanted me inside Caleb's ranch," she said. Hess was very still. "Not me specifically, but someone like me. A bookkeeper he could get information from, or pressure or use." She looked at the document. "He didn't know I'd end up on the other side of it." "That's my read," Hess said quietly. She sat with that for a moment. The woman who had arrived shaking and penniless and 18 years old in a street full of strangers. That woman had been in some sense a piece on Victor Holloway's board. Moved there by a faller, by a manufactured promise, by a man who treated people as instruments. She felt the anger rise clean and clarifying the way anger did when it had solid ground to stand on. "It doesn't change the evidence," she said. "No," Hess agreed. "And it doesn't change what I chose to do when I got here." "No," he said again. "It doesn't." She nodded once. "Then let's continue." She didn't tell Caleb immediately. She needed to carry it herself for a little while first, to turn it over and look at it from all sides until it stopped feeling like the ground shifting and started feeling like a fact she could work with. She had a way of doing that, had learned it young, and she used it on the walk from the hotel to where Caleb was waiting with the horses. He looked at her when she came up. He could read her face now. She knew had learned to read it somewhere in the last 3 weeks the way she'd learned to read his. He didn't ask what was wrong. He waited. "Hess found something," she said. "Tell me," she told him. She said it plainly, without editorializing the way she reported figures in the ledger, just the facts in order with the conclusions they led to. She watched his face while she talked, and she saw the things move through it. Surprise, then the rapid processing of implications, then something harder and more specific. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Fitch sent you that letter, he said. Yes. Holloway's man sent you into my ranch. Likely yes. His jaw tightened. He was going to use you. He was going to try, she said. He looked at her with something in his face that was too layered to name simply anger on her behalf. Certainly. But underneath it, something more personal. The particular feeling of a man who realizes how close something bad had come and is only now retroactively afraid of it. Evelyn, I'm all right, she said. I've thought it through. It doesn't change what I did, or what you did, or what we built. She met his eyes steadily. It changes where I started. It doesn't change where I am. He held her gaze for a long moment. The street moved around them, horses and wagons, and the ordinary noise of a Friday afternoon, and they stood in the middle of it like two people who had found a still point and were not in a hurry to leave it. You could have been anybody, he said quietly. He could have sent anybody. But he sent me, she said. Yes, Caleb said. He did. And something in his voice made the words carry more than their surface meaning, the specific gratitude of a man who understands that what looked like misfortune was the thing that changed everything. Holloway made his last move at 6 o'clock. They were at the livery preparing to ride back to the ranch when Raphael appeared at a run, and Raphael did not run unless something warranted it. Holloway's lawyer filed an emergency motion, Raphael said, breathing hard. Private property injunction on the Morgan Ranch. Says Caleb trespassed on Holloway's claimed land, the east parcel, and damaged property. Caleb's expression didn't change. That's invented. I know it is, but the motion's filed and Crane's considering it. Raphael looked between them. If Crane grants it, they can lock you out of the east pasture until the federal proceeding. That's your water access for the summer cattle. He's trying to hurt the ranch even if he can't get the land, Evelyn said. Make the fight expensive enough that you have to settle. It's a stalling tactic, Caleb said. It's an effective one. She was already thinking. Does Hess know? Going to him now, Raphael said. Then go. Caleb looked at her. Can he block it? He can if he files a federal hold on all related proceedings. He has grounds. The motion is directly tied to the property under federal investigation. She picked up the ledger from where she'd set it on the fence post. We need to get back to Hess. Now. They went back to the hotel at a pace that was not quite a run and was not polite. Hess heard the motion, heard Evelyn's analysis, and had his assistant draft the federal hold in 22 minutes. The marshal signed it. It was delivered to Judge Crane's office before Crane had finished reading Holloway's emergency motion. Crane looked at the federal hold. He looked at the marshal's signature. He set Holloway's motion face down on his desk. The message came back to the hotel in 40 minutes. Motion denied pending federal review. Raphael. When he heard, sat down on a bench in the hotel lobby and put his face in his hands, not from grief, but from the release of tension. So prolonged, he'd stopped noticing how heavy it was. Caleb stood in the lobby and looked at Evelyn. She looked back. It's not over, she said. The federal proceeding is still weeks away. I know, he said. He'll try again. I know that too. We need to be ready. Evelyn. He said her name in the specific way he had quietly, with the weight of someone who meant every syllable. I know all of that. I'm not worried about all of that right now. She stopped. He took a step toward her, and then another, until there was not very much space between them, and what he was going to say was only for her. I spent 8 months carrying this alone, he said. Every day of that I thought, this is what alone is. This is just what my life is. His voice was low and entirely certain, not the voice of a man reaching for words, but a man finally able to say what had been true for longer than he'd acknowledged it. And then you came, and you picked up the ledger, and you read what needed reading, and you stood in a courtroom full of people twice your age, and said things that needed saying. He paused. And I stopped thinking of my life as something I carry alone. The lobby was very quiet. Somewhere behind them, Raphael was being very interested in the wallpaper. She looked at Caleb Morgan, at this man who had been shaped by loneliness and loss into something harder and more careful than he'd been born, and who was standing in a hotel lobby in a dusty Wyoming town, offering her the most honest thing she'd ever been offered by anyone. "I'm still an 18-year-old bookkeeper with a broken carpet bag," she said, because she needed him to know she understood exactly what she was and wasn't. "I know exactly what you are," he said. "That's why I'm saying this." She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, the summer light was going gold over the ridgeline rooftops, and the town was moving into the particular grace of a Friday evening, and Evelyn Carter, who had come west with nothing and no one, and a letter that turned out to be a lie, felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long time. She felt found. "All right," she said quietly. "All right," he said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a resolution. It was two words that meant 100 things and needed to mean only one thing right now, and both of them knew it. Raphael turned back from the wallpaper and said with enormous dignity, "Should I get the horses?" "Yes," they both said at the same moment, and they rode home. The weeks after Ridgeline were not quiet. Evelyn had known they wouldn't be. Holloway was not the kind of man who accepted a setback and recalibrated gracefully. He was the kind of man who treated every obstacle as a personal insult and responded by applying more pressure in a different place. She had read enough about men like him in the ledgers. She'd kept her whole working life. The numbers always told you who someone was, and Holloway's numbers said relentless. The pressure came in the form of lawyers first. Letters arrived at the ranch every few days, formal, carefully worded each one, finding a new procedural angle to threaten. One claimed Caleb had violated a water use ordinance on the East Creek. Another raised a question about the original land patent for the North Pasture. A third most aggressively suggested that Evelyn herself had obtained her position at the Morgan Ranch under false pretenses, and that any evidence she had gathered was therefore tainted. She read each letter at the kitchen table and made notes in the margin in her small, precise handwriting. Caleb read them after her, his face unchanging, and then he set them in a pile for Hess. Hess, for his part, was building a federal case with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had been waiting 14 months for exactly this quality of evidence. He wired the ranch twice a week. He had requested the full cooperation of 3 county sheriffs and had received it from 2. The third Ridgeline's own sheriff, a man named Purdy, who had been in Holloway's pocket since at least 1879, had declined to cooperate and was now himself the subject of a separate inquiry. The news of that particular development reached the ranch on a Tuesday morning, and Raphael celebrated by making a cake, which he had never done before, and which was not entirely successful, but which everyone ate anyway, with genuine appreciation for the effort. "The sheriff is under investigation," Tom Pickett said when he rode over that afternoon to hear the news in person. He said it slowly, like a man tasting something he hadn't expected to enjoy. "Purdy's under federal investigation. Preliminary inquiry," Evelyn said. "But yes." Tom looked at Caleb. "You understand what that means for the valley?" "I understand," Caleb said. "Because Purdy's been covering Holloway's enforcement work for years. Every time someone got a threat, every time cattle turned up dead, or a fence line got cut, Purdy looked the other way." Tom's voice had gone hard. "There are people in this valley who lost land they shouldn't have lost because that man looked the other way." "I know," Caleb said. "Hess knows it too." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Walt Delaney called it a night before it was. Said he couldn't fight. I want to know if Walt gets his land back." Evelyn looked at Tom. "Hess believes that fraudulently induced sales can be challenged in federal court. It's not simple and it's not fast, but the legal standing exists." She paused. "Tell Walt to get his papers together." Tom exhaled a long, slow breath that carried the weight of everything he'd been holding since April. "All right," he said. "All right." The first real break came 5 weeks after Ridgeline. It didn't come from Hess, or from the federal proceeding, or from anything Evelyn had anticipated. It came from Gerald Fitch. Fitch apparently had decided that the distance between Denver and a federal prison was not sufficient, and that the distance between Denver and a cooperation agreement was considerably more comfortable. He had contacted the federal land office through his own lawyer, and what he had offered in exchange for reduced charges was enough to make Hess wire Caleb at 6 in the morning with 3 words. "He's talking. Everything." Evelyn was at the kitchen table when Caleb came in with the wire. She read it. She read it again. Then she set it down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something fragile. Everything, she said. Everything, he confirmed. She had known intellectually that the case would resolve. She had built it to resolve. But knowing something and feeling it were different operations, and she sat for a moment with the specific feeling of a wall that has been pressing against you for a very long time, beginning fractionally to give. "What does everything mean?" Raphael asked from the doorway. He had developed a habit of appearing in doorways at significant moments, and neither of them had the heart to point it out. "It means Fitch is giving Hess the names and the documents and the financial records going back to when Harlan Holloway started the scheme," Evelyn said. "It means the federal case doesn't rest on our documents alone." She looked at Caleb. "It means Victor Holloway is going to lose." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "How long?" Caleb asked. "Weeks, not months. With Fitch cooperating, the proceeding moves faster." She picked up her coffee. "We still have to appear in Cheyenne. I still have to testify." "I'll be there," he said. "I know you will." She looked at him across the table, this man who had been shaped by loneliness into someone who showed up, who stopped, who picked up what others dropped, and she thought about Gerald Fitch's letter that had brought her here, and the strange, round, unlikely shape of how things had gone. "He tried to use me," she said. "Fitch, Holloway. They sent that letter to put someone inside your ranch, and what they got instead was someone who burned the whole scheme down." Caleb looked at her steadily. "Are you still angry about it?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about things she needed to understand, rather than things she needed to perform. "No," she said after a moment. "I think I was for a few days, but being angry at it means believing I would have been better off somewhere else, and I don't believe that." He was quiet. His hands were around his coffee cup, and his eyes were on her face, and he had the expression he got when something mattered to him that he wasn't going to say out loud. She let him not say it. She had learned to let him carry things in his own way. The second break was uglier. 3 days after Fitch's cooperation agreement went through, someone cut the fence line on Caleb's east pasture in 3 places. Caleb found it on his morning ride, and came back to the ranch with a flatness in his face that she had learned to recognize as controlled anger, the kind that burned slow and clean without spray. He told her. He told Raphael. He told his 2 ranch hands, Jensen and Marks, who had been with the ranch long enough to take it personally. "Holloway," Raphael said. "Or someone working for him who hasn't gotten the news yet that the case is moving," Caleb said. "Does it matter which?" Evelyn asked. Caleb looked at her. "No," he said. "It doesn't." "Then fix the fence and wire Hess. Document the damage." She held his gaze. "Don't ride out looking for who did it." His jaw tightened. "That's my land. I know it's your land. That's why you don't go out there angry and do something that gives Holloway's lawyers a story to tell." She kept her voice steady and direct, the way she'd learned he responded to best. "Fix the fence. Wire Hess. Document it. That's the play." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Jensen, get the wire cutters." She had noticed somewhere in the weeks since Ridgeline that he listened to her differently than he'd listened to anyone. Not with deference, not with the performance of patience, but with the actual weight of genuine consideration. He didn't always agree. He'd told her twice that she was wrong about something, and been right both times, and she'd told him so, which had startled him more than the disagreement had. But he listened, and when he agreed, he acted on it cleanly, without ego. She found that rarer than almost anything else she knew. Hess's response to the fence-cutting wire arrived the next day, with the additional information that Holloway had been served with a federal injunction that morning, prohibiting him or his agents from interfering with properties under investigation. The marshal had delivered it personally. The fence-cutting stopped. They left for Cheyenne on a Wednesday 6 weeks after the courtroom in Ridgeline. It was Evelyn, Caleb, Tom Pickett, Vera Hartley, Jim Cotter, and Agnes, who had been invited to testify and had accepted with the air of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity. Raphael stayed with the ranch and was given a list of instructions by Caleb that took 10 minutes to deliver, to which Raphael listened with patient attentiveness and then said, "I know, Mr. Morgan. I've been doing this for 4 years. Go." Caleb went. The Cheyenne Federal Courthouse was larger and more formal than anything Ridgeline offered, and it had the particular quality of an institution that took itself seriously. Evelyn had been in exactly one courthouse before in her life, a county building in Salina, where she'd witnessed a property transfer for Mr. Draper, and this was nothing like that. This had marble floors and federal seals and clerks who moved with the brisk certainty of people who understood the weight of what they handled. She felt walking in both entirely out of place and entirely prepared. Hess met them in the corridor. He shook Caleb's hand and looked at Evelyn's ledger. The same battered ledger that had traveled from Kansas with her, that had been hidden in Vera Hartley's bread box, that contained the organized evidence that had started all of this with something close to affection. "That book is going to be Exhibit A," he said. "I'd like it back when this is done," she said. "You'll have it." He looked at her steadily. "You ready?" She thought about 18 years old, and a broken carpet bag, and a street full of strangers. She thought about numbers on a page telling the truth when people wouldn't. She thought about 3 copies of a promissory note, and a lamp burning late, and a man who had said come back, and meant it with his whole self. "Yes," she said. She testified for 4 hours. She had been afraid before she took the stand of the particular species of condescension she'd encountered her whole life. The raised eyebrow, the slightly too patient tone, the implicit question of what would you know about this? The federal attorney for the opposing side was a man from Denver named Carver, who wore very good boots and had the bearing of someone who had gone through law school, assuming the world would arrange itself around his convenience. He tried the condescension in his second question. "Miss Carter, you say you are a bookkeeper. You're 18 years old, and you've had no formal legal training. Can you explain to this court why we should treat your analysis of these documents as authoritative?" She looked at him calmly. "Because the analysis is based on the documents themselves, not on my age. The documents say what they say. I can explain what they say, and anyone in this room can look at them and verify that I've described them accurately." She paused. "Would you like me to walk through each one?" Carver paused. "That won't be necessary." "I'm happy to," she said pleasantly. "I have time." Behind Carver she could see Hess with his hand over his mouth. She walked through each document. She took her time. She was clear and precise, and she did not use a single word. She couldn't define if pressed, and when Carver tried to interrupt her with technical objections, the federal judge, a gray-haired woman named Aldrich, who had been listening with the focused attention of someone who read people as naturally as Evelyn read numbers, sustained exactly none of them. When Carver sat down, Judge Aldrich looked at Evelyn over her glasses and said, "Thank you, Miss Carter. That was exceptionally clear." Evelyn said, "Thank you, Your Honor," and stepped down. Her legs, which had been entirely steady for 4 hours, shook slightly on the walk back to her seat. She sat down beside Caleb and looked straight ahead. His hand found hers under the table. Brief, solid, certain. She held on for exactly 3 seconds. Then they both let go. The twist came on the second day, and it came from a direction no one had anticipated. Victor Holloway had been present throughout the first day of proceedings, with the composed, slightly contemptuous manner of a man who believed he was temporarily inconvenienced. His lawyers had been good. His position had been presented as the legitimate exercise of inherited legal rights. The documentation as authentic. The federal investigation as an overreach driven by the complaints of ranchers who had simply failed to manage their financial obligations. It had been credible enough to be uncomfortable. On the second morning, Gerald Fitch took the stand. Fitch was a narrow man with careful hands, who had the look of someone who had made a career of sitting in rooms where the most important people were other people. He sat in the witness chair with the particular stillness of someone who had decided to burn something down and was making peace with it. He described in precise and ordered detail the operation he had run for Victor Holloway over 7 years. The false employment offers. The manufactured positions used to place people in targeted properties to gather information, to create leverage occasionally, to directly facilitate document access. The list of ranches going back to 1877. The financial records from the Denver law firm, showing Holloway's direct involvement in every fraudulent lien. The communication chain between Holloway and Judge Crane documented over 4 years. And then, almost at the end, he said something that made the courtroom go very still. Miss Carter's employment offer was specifically targeted, Fitch said. We identified the Morgan Ranch 18 months ago as a priority acquisition due to the East Creek water source. We needed someone inside the ranch's financial records. We circulated her name through Kansas employment networks as a skilled bookkeeper without other prospects. The letter was designed to be irresistible to someone in her situation. Evelyn sat very still. She had known this. Hess had told her weeks ago, but hearing it said aloud in a federal courtroom in flat matter-of-fact testimony was different from knowing it abstractly. She had been selected, targeted. Her desperation had been identified and used as a tool with the same cold precision that Holloway had applied to dead men's debts. Caleb was not touching her hand this time. He was sitting with both his hands on his knees and a jaw so tight she could see the muscle in it, and she knew without looking at his face that he was furious in the deep, clean way. He got furious, not hot, not explosive, just bedrock certain. Carver stood immediately. Your Honor, the witness's characterization of Miss Carter's employment as targeted is speculation. The documentation supports it, Fitch said quietly without heat. I have the internal correspondence. He produced a folder that his lawyer handed to the court clerk. Judge Aldrich read the first page. She read the second. She set the folder down and looked at Victor Holloway, and the look she gave him was not the look of a judge performing impartiality. It was the look of a woman who had seen something she found genuinely contemptible. Holloway met her gaze with practiced composure. He did not look at Evelyn. When the session recessed for the midday meal, Caleb found Evelyn standing in the corridor outside the courtroom, and he stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her face with the full attention he gave things that mattered to him. Say something, she said before he could ask how she was. I'm going to need a minute, he said. His voice was very controlled. Before I can say anything useful. She almost smiled. Take your time. He looked down the corridor, breathing, she realized, in the slow, deliberate way of a man managing something. Then he looked back at her. They saw you as disposable, he said. Interchangeable. A body to put in a position they needed filled. His voice hadn't risen. It was perfectly level and absolutely furious. And you walked into my ranch with a broken bag and $22 and no reason to trust a single person you met, and you took every piece of what they tried to do to you, and you turned it into this. He gestured back toward the courtroom. Into a federal case that's going to take down a man who's been doing this for 20 years. She held his gaze. I had help, she said. You had me, he said. I didn't do this. You did. Caleb, let me finish. He took a breath. I have been wanting to say something to you for about 6 weeks, and I have been waiting for a time that was appropriate, and I am done waiting for appropriate. He looked at her directly with all the guards down, and none of the careful distance he'd kept for years, and all of the directness that was his most natural quality when he let it be. I don't want you to leave the ranch when this is over. I don't want you to think of it as a position you hold until something better comes along. I want... He stopped. He looked at his hands. He looked back at her. I want you to think of it as home, if that's something you want. The corridor was empty around them and very quiet. She thought about the letter. She thought about Ridgeline in the dust and nobody stopping. She thought about 3 copies of a promissory note and a lamp burning late and a man who brought coffee without being asked and said come back. Like those 2 words contained everything. You're asking me to stay, she said. I am, he said. I'm also asking you to understand that I'm not good at saying things, that I will probably do it badly more than once, that I don't know how to be... He paused. I've been alone a long time. I've gotten used to it. And I'm telling you that I would rather learn how to not be alone than spend another year the way I spent the last 8 months. She looked at him for a long moment. I came west with nothing, she said. You know that. I know. I don't have a family or a reference or anything to offer that a sensible person would call security. I know all of that, he said patiently. I'm also 18 years old, and I have strong opinions, and I will argue with you when I think you're wrong. You've been doing that since day 2, he said. I've survived it. She almost smiled again. This time she let it happen. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes, you'll stay, or yes, you'll argue with me. Both, she said. Yes to both. Something moved through his face, the slow, certain release of something long held. Not a dramatic change, just a man who had been braced for a long time letting go of the brace. All right, he said. The same 2 words she'd said to him in a Ridgeline hotel lobby 6 weeks ago. All right, she agreed. Judge Aldrich delivered her findings on the 3rd day. The ruling was comprehensive, and from Evelyn's perspective beautifully organized. It worked through the evidence in the exact order. Hest had presented it, addressed every counter-argument Carver had made, and arrived at its conclusions with the clean inevitability of a proof in arithmetic. 14 fraudulent liens across 3 counties were declared void. The associated land claims were dissolved. The properties that could be legally restored were to be restored. Those that had already been sold would be subject to separate remediation proceedings. Victor Holloway was found liable on 11 counts of federal land fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy. Judge Crane's judicial conduct was referred for separate disciplinary review, which was a careful legal phrase that meant his career was finished. Gerald Fitch's cooperation agreement reduced his exposure substantially, and he would carry that reduction along with whatever he was able to look at in the mirror, which was his own affair. The reading of the findings took 40 minutes. Evelyn sat beside Caleb and listened to every word with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered. And when Judge Aldrich reached the section dealing specifically with the Morgan Ranch, the East Parcel, the fraudulent lien, the restoration of clear title, she felt Caleb exhale beside her, a single long breath that he'd probably been holding for 8 months. She didn't say anything. She put her hand briefly on his arm and then took it back. He covered it with his own hand before she could. They stayed like that until the gavel fell. The ride home from Cheyenne took 2 days, and they stopped the first night at a way station that had 4 rooms and a cook who made the best biscuits Evelyn had encountered since her mother's, and she said so. And the cook, a large woman named Dottie, looked at her with the expression of someone receiving their due and said, "Sit down, honey, I'll make you more." Caleb sat across from her and drank his coffee and watched her eat 3 biscuits and said nothing, which was its own kind of conversation. Tom Pickett at the other end of the table was writing a letter to Walt Delaney. Vera Hart had fallen asleep in her chair with her arms crossed and her chin on her chest, and Harold Hartley was very carefully not doing anything that might wake her. Agnes had found the cook's cat and was conducting a private interview with it in the corner. It was the most ordinary evening Evelyn had experienced in 2 months. She found she liked ordinary enormously. "What happens to the ranch now?" she asked. Caleb looked up. "What do you mean?" "The federal ruling clears your title. You get the East Parcel back without contest. Holloway can't touch the water rights." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "What do you do with that?" I thought about it in his way slowly, thoroughly, without performing the thinking. "Expand the herd," he said. "Been holding back because of the uncertainty. If the East Creek is clear, I can run twice the summer cattle." He paused. "Fix the east fence properly. Jensen's been patching it with scrap wire for 3 years. It needs replacing." He looked at her. "I'll need the books in order." "Your books are already in order," she said. "They'll need to stay that way." "They will," he nodded. "Then I reckon we have work to do when we get back." She looked at him. "Caleb." "That's not what I was asking." He met her eyes. The lamp on the table between them was small and steady, and his face in the light of it was open in the way it had become over weeks. The door not just ajar now, but standing wide and the air coming through it entirely clear. "I know," he said. "I was getting there." She waited. "I was going to build another room," he said. "On the east side of the house. It gets the morning light." He said it simply, like he was reporting a plan he'd already made, which she suspected he had. "If that suits you. Or we do it different. However you want it." She looked at him across the lamp. She had arrived in Wyoming with a broken bag and $22 and a letter that turned out to be a lie. She had arrived with no prospects and no one and nothing she could call a future that she hadn't built herself piece by piece with the same care she brought to columns of figures that needed to come out right. She had built this herself too, this thing between them, this stubborn, honest, unglamorous thing that had grown in the space between a man who couldn't ask for help and a woman who couldn't afford to stop offering it. She had built it without knowing she was building it the way the best things got built. "East Side gets the morning light," she said. "Yes," he said. "That suits me," she said. He nodded once like a man receiving information he intended to act on immediately and permanently. Agnes from the corner said without looking up from the cat, "About time." They reached the ranch on a Friday afternoon in August, 7 weeks to the day since Evelyn had first walked into the Ridgeline courthouse with a borrowed rifle and a ledger full of evidence and more nerve than she'd known she had. Raphael was at the fence line when they came up the road, and when he saw them, the expression on his face was the expression of someone who has been managing anxiety by staying busy for 2 days and is profoundly relieved to have a reason to stop. "How'd it go?" he asked, before the horses had fully stopped. "We won," Caleb said. Raphael closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and said, "The north pasture fence held while you were gone. I also fixed the hinge on the barn door that's been sticking since March, and I made supper." "I see you've been busy," Caleb said. "I had feelings," Raphael said with enormous dignity. "I managed them through labor." Caleb got down from his horse and put his hand on Raphael's shoulder, the way he did brief, solid no words, and Raphael straightened up and nodded and took the reins. Evelyn climbed down and stood in the yard. The ranch was exactly as she had left it. The dark timber house, the barn, the root cellar built into the hillside, the horses in the near pasture. Everything worn and everything cared for. Everything built by hands that had intended it to last. She had a room with a window facing the mountain. She had a desk and a lamp and a ledger that had been entered as federal evidence and would be returned to her within 30 days, per Hess's written assurance. She had a job that was real work, not light work exactly as she'd been promised on the first day. And she had something that no letter had ever promised her, and no false job offer could have manufactured. She had a place that knew her name. Caleb came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her. He just stood there in the way he had, solid and present and entirely without pretense, and looked at the ranch, the way a man looks at something he has nearly lost and is still processing the nearness of it. "Your father built that barn," she said. "Yes," he said. He'd be glad it's still standing. He was quiet for a moment. "He'd be glad of more than that," he said. She looked at him. I was looking at this mountain at the east slope, the creek, the 40 acres that were his again, cleanly and completely and without contest. And his face had an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the hard-won calm of a man managing difficulty. Not the guarded, careful look of someone protecting himself from further loss. Just peace. Ordinary, uncomplicated peace, worn with the slightly unfamiliar look of something a man puts on after not having worn it for a very long time. "What do we start with tomorrow?" she asked. "The east fence," he said. "Then the books. I'll have the supply accounts updated by noon." "I know you will." He glanced at her, and in the glance was the full weight of everything he had and had not said over 7 weeks. Every careful approach, and every deliberate honesty, and every moment of choosing her. Choosing to let the door stand open. "You always do what you say you'll do." "So do you," she said. He looked back at this mountain. She looked at it too, enormous and permanent and indifferent to human trouble, in the way that only very old things could be. But around its indifference, something warmer. Something that had everything to do with who was standing in front of it. "I spent my whole life protecting this land," he said. He said it quietly, like something he was finally understanding the full shape of. She looked at him. "And now?" I was still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her directly, completely, with all the reserve gone and nothing between them but the plain truth of two people who had chosen each other through the hardest weeks either of them had lived and were still standing. "Now," he said, "I finally have someone to share it with." The summer light lay long and gold over the Wyoming mountains, and the ranch was quiet around them. And Evelyn Carter, who had come west with nothing, and had built everything, stood in the yard of a place that was hers, beside a man who had chosen her and felt for the first time in a life that had given her very little to be certain of completely and permanently home.